Yeah, we can now.
Now there's a way to kill that. Okay. All right. So, Javat, do you want to say what this whole series is about? I mean, do you want to introduce the series as a whole?
Um, Hello everyone. Good early afternoon. This is one of the webinars in the series of Mackay Mining Matters, and we started this series of webinars last year. We had a gap of 3 months now. We are back again with a new talk. Uh, we were covering many areas in mining and metallurgical engineering arena. We tried to cover new technologies, community related topics, and so many things. They're very diverse topics were covered. If you would like to access our previous webinars, they are all recorded and posted on our department's LinkedIn page. The LinkedIn page is called UNR's Mining and Metallurgical Engineering Department. You can easily find it on LinkedIn. If you cannot find it, please email me at jsadarand@unr.edu. I'll be happy to direct you to that page. This talk will be recorded as well, and we will post it on our LinkedIn page as well. Today we have Jeff Parshley. He is the co-chair of our professional advisory board for the department. We appreciate his support. We benefited from his support for a couple of years now. And he's going to talk about the community and environmental legacy, socioeconomic impacts of mine closure. Jeff.
Thank you, Javad. So this is actually a subject I've been working on for a number of years, and I find it fascinating. I also think it's one of those areas of mine closure that we perhaps don't understand as well, or haven't had as much experience as we'd like to get really good at it. So I find it still interesting. It's a lot of learning that's going on. Here's my very short bio. I am not a Mackay grad. I graduated from Dartmouth with a degree in geology in 1980 and spent the first 8 years or so of my career as exploration research geologist. And then 36 years ago, I got hired on by SRK as a resource geologist. And for the first 2 years, I did a lot of that, but almost immediately I got involved in closure here in Nevada. And I've been doing that for 35 plus years. I need to update this slide. So today we're going to talk briefly, when we talk about mine closure, what do we talk about? We're going to set the stage there. Then I want to talk about some of these other subjects, and hopefully we can go through them all. And there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. If you have something that's really burning, I think you can raise your hand. Yeah, you can raise your hand, and I'll try and keep an eye on that. And Alexia can do that as well. So let's start here at the very beginning. What is mine closure? By the way, as I go through this, I should let you know that most of the photos, unless they're otherwise annotated with a source, were taken either by myself or one of my colleagues. This is actually a photograph of a oceanic tailings disposal site down in Peru. So why do we close mines? Well, basically, we're trying to mitigate impacts of the mine, and we're trying to reduce overall liabilities. And the liabilities and risk can be financial, they can be environmental, they can be to protect communities. Bottom line is, in most parts of the world nowadays, at least where there's major mining industries with a fairly well-developed governance system, there is some kind of law that requires something with respect to mine closure. But what I've noticed over the last 30 plus years is that the industry has changed, and culturally, as an industry, we recognize that mine closure is the right thing to do. So, first of all, we have to realize the impacts of mining. Mining will change the land and landscape. There's no doubt about it. You can't hide a great big open pit. Mines will also change the social, cultural, and economic context of the regions where the mines are located. What we realize is that we increase wealth for those communities and the affected peoples during the operation, but that is rarely sustainable. As a matter of fact, I'm not aware of any instance where it has been fully sustainable after closure. And, we need to understand what these impacts are going to be before we even open an operation. That's just good practice in mine closure, not only in the socioeconomic aspects, but also in the biophysical and engineering as well. And then what we have found is that a lot can change in a community, in the mining site, on the mine site, in the regulatory governance process through the life of a mine. So the socioeconomic impacts need to be reassessed as you approach closure. Great example of this was a site I worked on in Tanzania. And when the mine opened up, there were about 10,000 people on the site. And now there's about 100,000 people in this community. It's turned from a fairly good sized town to a small city. And obviously 100,000 people are not working for the mine. So there's a lot else going on there. So I want to talk a little bit about a mine closure plan. I don't want to get lost in this piece of it, but I want to talk about the fact that it's not something that is just looking at the physical rehabilitation of the site. And this actually comes from the IFC environmental health and safety guidelines for the mining industry. And you'll see here that not only are they worried about public health and safety in the future, but they're also looking for beneficial and sustainable uses and socioeconomic benefits. These are things that they've called out. They believe they're important. So a little bit about the history of mine closure, and what this graph shows. In the background, you see a price of gold. This actually I think I only take this up through about 2020. So right about the time COVID started. But you'll notice that back at the very beginning, we had the gold standard, $20 an ounce, and the government controlled that. And then obviously we had these various periods where the price of gold changed. And the reason I put this on this graphic, which also shows the various mine closure laws that were implemented or modified around the world during this period of time, is you'll see that things were fairly good when we had roughly $400 an ounce gold in the 1990s. And then things kind of took a dip, and things got pretty rough back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And this happens to coincide with a period of time where we've really started looking carefully at the socioeconomic transitioning, really the economic and social effects of mine closure. And on this particular thing, pointing out that during the period from 2000 until 2002, there was an initiative called the Mining, Minerals, and Sustainable Development Initiative, and they issued their report in 2002. One of the things they did look at was a general look at the issues of socioeconomic transitioning. And it's really been since that time that we as an industry, and myself personally, have really gotten more involved in looking at these issues and how they relate to mine closure. So we've been doing mine closure, particularly in Nevada, but in a modern sense, we've been doing it for the last 3 to 4 decades. And what we have learned is a number of key things. Closure is part of the mine life cycle, and so you have to consider it from the very beginning. And doing so is absolutely essential. This issue of people, though, has become a much more important aspect of mine closure in recent years, and we're recognizing the impacts of people on from mine closure are actually very significant and need to be taken into account. So when we design for closure, we look at a number of things. We look at the permanent changes that mining will create as a result of the operations. And those are both environmental and socioeconomic. We're going to talk a little bit more of those in detail. Now, the net impact of these of a mine, even though it does make permanent changes, can be positive. Obviously, there's wealth generated during the operations, and depending on how that is dealt with, that can actually overall be a net positive impact. And one of the things we always say about closure is we start with the end in mind. Now, good segue. Well, this is not what we usually have at the end in mind, but we have to recognize, and often it's a criticism of mining industry, that you're just going to create a boom bust economy. And what people think of is a photograph like this. This is actually Bodie, Nevada. And, we've all seen around Nevada, most of these sites are in Nevada or California. The one in the lower left is actually up in Alaska, at Anaconda in Alaska, a copper operation. But these are all places where people came, they mined the resource. As we all know, mining resources are finite. The resource goes away and people leave. And so when people talk about a boom bust economy, they're typically talking about it in a very negative way, and they're thinking about this end, the end point, which is there's nothing there left. What they often forget is that there is a boom and a peak. This is coming from Forbes, and they'd actually define these different phases of the boom bust economy. And obviously, as you can imagine, Forbes, they're talking about it in the context of an economy, which we often talk about it in terms of a town, but the two are linked. And basically, the boom phase is a period of time where credit is cheap and you can get it. It's easy. The value of homes and whatnot is increasing. So, and people, but at the same time, with employment rates high, people can borrow money to buy a home. You can buy big ticket items, furnitures, appliances, home renovations. And obviously, then there's a peak after which things start to change. But during that peak is where prices in an economy are the highest. Economic indicators are at the highest, but you're basically at a point where there's little to no room for future growth. And this can have a whole bunch of impacts. You can end up with overbuilt housing, excesses in consumer goods and other things. And then eventually you end up in a bust. And this is a point where prices and values start to fall. And employees get let go because the mine is shutting down in the case of a mining bust. Unemployed or underemployed consumers may not be able to pay off debt. The value of your houses and your other material possessions decreases. And eventually you get to a point where they call the trough, which is the very, very lowest period. And during that time, you basically have the economy bottoming out. There's nowhere to go but up. But at the same time, if you have no potential for any kind of economy in the area, which is often the case with mines, because you basically took the one resource you had to create a vibrant economy, you can end up basically with a ghost town. So, socioeconomic transitioning, what is this? This is basically where we're trying to transition from a mining to a post-mining economic context for communities. And recognizing that when we close an operation, there will be socioeconomic impacts on the various affected and dependent communities. Obviously, the most obvious one that comes to mind is all the people who had jobs at the mine will no longer have those. We also have to recognize that anywhere from 1 to 5 jobs were created for everyone at a mine site, which means you have a lot of indirect employment, which will also be compromised if there is no other economy that's developed in the communities. And economic development money and community services are often compromised. And unfortunately, in many parts of the world, that means health services, which are often funded by the mining companies, also are compromised. And then, social investment programs that may have existed prior to and during operations, often, if they are not fully funded in a way that's sustainable, the available monies from those programs will be reduced or eliminated completely. However, if this is done, if you actually do the socioeconomic transition planning correctly, you can mitigate and mitigate a lot of these impacts and leave a positive legacy behind. Here's a few documents that are worth reading. There's some good information in these about this. The one at the top, I'm very proud of. Our team did this for the World Bank in 2021. So what are the benefits? Now, I'm not going to read all these little hexagons to you, but a couple I did want to point out. From a mining company perspective, this, if it's done well, it reduces the financial and maybe more importantly, the reputational liabilities and risks associated with closing a mine. But you also hopefully can create some sustainable opportunities that leaves a positive legacy. There are challenges with it, a lot of them. And these are things we're still working on. That's one of the reasons I find this subject fascinating. We still have a lot of challenges that require solutions, and we're still working on all of these. The challenges are, one of the biggest challenges we have, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is understanding what responsibilities and ownership there is for this process. And then understanding, we often have very limited knowledge on what the risks and impacts are. And one of the challenges we've had recently when we've been doing work for the World Bank, we realized that there's very little monitoring that's been done by industry, or maybe I should say there may be monitoring going on, but we don't have the data from it. There's not a lot of public information out there about whether particular methodologies worked. So what does the industry think about this? Well, a few years back in 2020, the Mining Journal, we worked with the Mining Journal on a survey they did about mine closure. And one of the questions we asked, if I remember correctly, there were somewhere around 600 respondents to this survey around the world. And what we found, one of the questions we asked is what they thought the most important key performance indicator was for mine closure. And we then took their answers and grouped them by these 5 categories. And what was really interesting was socioeconomic transitioning. Those things that fell into that category ended up being the #1 KPI identified by the mining industry. And compliance, following the rules, was a close second. Everything else was considerably less important based on the survey. When we broke this down by region, it became even more interesting. And what you see on the right-hand side in Africa and Asia and the Middle East, you'll see that more or less 50% of the respondents said that socioeconomic issues were the most significant. And then I was actually a little surprised at Central and South America. I expected a larger number than the overall there, but that's not what we got. They were very compliance focused and risk management focused, which I thought was quite interesting. So the ICMM good practice guidelines, which were republished in a new version in early 2019, talk about the basic process of mine closure. Now, one of the things that surprised me when I saw the original version of that, which was published in 2008, was that it talked almost exclusively about stakeholder engagement and socioeconomic transitioning, with very little effort spent on talking about technical issues. I think that that's probably because the industry has by that time had a pretty good handle on what the biophysical and rehabilitation issues were, but these were the areas where we probably needed a little more guidance. And I think the good practice guidelines that came out in 2019, the new version, actually provide a pretty good roadmap of the things you need to look for. And we're going to talk about these as we go. One thing I noticed early when I started getting involved in socioeconomic transitioning was things that I heard from various groups. We have the groups of scientists, we have the engineers, we have the money people, we have the managers, we have the community relations people, and the social scientists. And it was very interesting. Those last couple of groups tend not to communicate really well with the first group, the engineers, the scientists, the people who are doing the physical closure of the site and planning that. Often there was siloing that occurred. And as a result of that, I think there were some poorly considered ideas that came out a number of times in the socioeconomic transitioning realm. And there were a lot of engineering solutions that didn't fit well with what was needed for socioeconomic transitioning. We've been working on trying to fix that over the recent years, and we tend to put a larger group together on the team. So there are a few common misconceptions. One of the first ones that I heard all the time was, we will just solve the problem with people losing their jobs and the economy falling apart by providing alternative livelihoods to everybody. Second one was, well, people want to stay here, so they're not going to move, so we need to do something to provide them a living. And then the next one is, we can train the communities and governments to manage the services that would be potentially impacted during closure. There's a few others, but these are the three biggies. So the first conception is, we'll just get everybody other jobs and that's going to solve the problem. The problem with that is that mining salaries are higher than nearly every other industry in any country or region. If you look at these two charts here, the one on the right is the US. Average mining salary of $120,000. Average for all industries is $78,000. Okay, that was in 2022, and this is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. If you look at last year's numbers from Q3, here just in Nevada, all industries 62,452, and add 30,000 to that as an average annual salary for the mining industry. People, and you'll see this same trend anywhere you go in the world. I've lost track of how many countries, and I have never seen it where it's less than about 50 to maybe 100% higher for mining salaries. I've seen places in the world where it's as much as 12 times higher than a national average. The other thing is that a lot of money goes into training these employees, and they come out as skilled employees. These people have skills. They want to use those skills. They understand those skills are valuable. They don't want to be taken off of a excavator and being told that now you're going to drive a taxi or a bus, or you're going to start working in agriculture. The other thing is the mining industry has serious human resource shortages. And so people who have mining jobs want another mining job, and they know they can get it and get paid well. Misconception number two, people will stay in their communities. They want to stay where they've been living for, it could be generations, depending on the life of a mine. However, what we have found when we talk to employees who are facing a mine closure, and even people in the communities, is that people are more willing to move than we think they are. They are more capable of doing that. And where you have a trained workforce, they want to continue to work in the mining industry. We had people in Kyrgyzstan, when we interviewed them for the largest employer in the country, a mine that actually contributed anywhere between 7 and 10% of the GDP of the entire country, depending on the year. And those people said, when the mine shuts down, we know that we can go to other former Soviet states or Russia itself and get jobs because they've told us they want us. And they were even willing to leave their families behind and send money back to them from wherever they were going to work. The other thing that we've seen, and this has been very apparent in places where I've worked in former Soviet states, is a lot of times the younger generations don't want to stay in these towns. They often are remote, they don't have a lot of services, there's very little culture, and younger generations want to move to the city. Misconception number 3. I need another photo on this. We can train the community and governments to manage the services after closure. It's possible, but it takes more than simple training to ensure the long-term sustainability of these services. It requires people, and if your best people leave, you're going to be at a disadvantage. It requires money, and if there isn't a sustainable source of funding when the mine leaves, particularly if it's the only major income source in the area, you have a serious problem. And then there's cultural issues. There's just some parts of the world where maintenance is not a high priority. It's not something that's built into their culture. And eventually you will find that things break down and there may not be anybody there who can fix them, and there may not be money to fix them. The other thing is as people leave a community and it gets smaller and smaller, the impetus to try and maintain these community services diminishes. So how do we do this? How do we actually go through the process of socioeconomic transition? Well, the first thing we do is we create a vision, a closure vision. And I think this is actually a good definition that comes right out of the ICMM Good Practice Guide. It's an aspirational description of what will be achieved. Now, this is something that is done in context, in a post-mining context, but it's something that's shared by all stakeholders. So in other words, this is where the whole talking to the communities and other stakeholders comes in. And it needs to be developed as early as possible in the mine life cycle, preferably before you actually open the mine. And it needs to be reviewed and revised throughout the mining life. Things change, as I said before. The thing is it should be ambitious. That's what they mean by aspirational. But we have often seen the visions to be completely impractical and not achievable. So it needs to be ambitious, yes, but it also has to be achievable. And as Stephen Covey says in one of his books, begin with the end in mind. Now, the things we think about when we're coming up with a closure vision is how large of an area of influence do we have? Is this mine, the economy of this mine, is it affect just the local community? Is it a regional thing? The example I gave you from Kyrgyzstan, that was a national zone of influence. And then you need to understand the context of the site and what kinds of stakeholder relationships do you have? Do you have indigenous native populations that have a cultural connection to the land? And are those people part of your stakeholder group? They should be. And they may have a lot of influence on what the vision looks like for the future. One of the things we found in some of these areas is that the government often has regional development goals or plans, and we always want to make sure we look at those as part of this process to understand, maybe there's some government funding that could be used for future uses on the mine site. We listen to the stakeholders, but often they don't have very realistic perspective on what's possible. So we listen, but not necessarily do exactly what they want. We have to be realistic, and we need to understand what their true capacity and skill sets are. We've had a few instances where ownership of the land becomes an issue. We had some great plans done for a project in Suriname after closure, and the government came in as we were working on these and told us, no, you don't get to decide that. The land will revert to the government. We get to decide. So all our planning kind of went out the door, which was unfortunate. But again, who controls the land has a say in what happens in the future. So what typically are we looking for? One of the things we do is we define objectives. And these are typically very specific. If you don't have objectives and goals to measure, then you have no idea whether or not you've been successful. So they need to be achievable. You need to identify possible constraints of achieving those objectives. And we need to look at not just the physical, biophysical objectives, but we also need to look at the cultural, social, and economic ones. So some of the things that we actually consider as indicators of what's possible are obviously the demographics of the area. We need to understand the incomes during operations and what they could be afterwards. We need to understand what, if there are alternative livelihoods available, what do those kinds of incomes look like? We need to understand migration trends. Are people leaving? Are they losing the younger generation? Have there been new businesses that have developed during the mine operation or could be developed during the mine operation? And then we look at suppliers and crop yields, because often these towns are surrounded by agricultural development. And then, as I said before, we look at regional and local development programs. Now, I'm not going to explain this whole graph. This comes out of the World Bank Mine Closure Toolbox for Government. But this is basically, we were trying to understand, we got asked a question, well, whose responsibility is it to deal with mine closure and socioeconomic transitioning? And what we realized is that it's not one entity's responsibility. There are several entities that have responsibilities, and there are a number of shared responsibilities. Obviously, the mining companies and the governments are probably the first two, but then the communities also have responsibilities. And one of the things that we are seeing more and more is that there's also a possibility to get corporate, non-mining corporate sector involved in developing alternative economies that could help mitigate socioeconomic impacts of mine closure. You can read more about this in that toolbox if you're interested. Now, one of the things that we talk about monotowns or mono-cities, and these are things, you saw some examples of the ghost towns. At the time, they were really basically just there because the mine's there. One of the places we've been able to look at these and the impacts of them recently are the former Soviet states and Russia itself. And what we see there is basically the government went and created a town, moved people, said, you're now miners, and these people work there. Typically, what we found is there's really only a single industry. In a few instances, we saw the government try and generate a few other industries, but often those collapsed with the fall of the Soviet Union. So the only thing left really is the mining. And you end up with limited job opportunities and people leaving the place to go somewhere else. This is one of the places where we encountered a lot of the younger generations leaving. And what we typically see also is that a lot of these places, particularly in places like the former Soviet states, we see low standards of living. And the maintenance and original engineering and construction of a lot of their infrastructure is not very satisfactory. And as a result, you not only come to the end of the mine life and people are losing their jobs, you often have infrastructure that is on its very last legs, which just exacerbates the problems. So how do we look for opportunities to do something else with the land? By the way, this is a former coal pit in Germany. It was a huge coal pit. It's now a giant recreational lake with a town growing up all around it. So we look at, obviously, the closure vision objectives we've come up with. We look at the mine plan, all of the physical and socioeconomic data, and we work through this process and come up, do economic analysis of what's possible, and what kinds of impacts is the mine going to have, and are there any constraints we have that we have to look at. So one of the things we look at when we're looking at repurposing opportunities, again, this is another old coal mine lake. These people are building vacation homes for rent around this lake. It needs to be economically practical, and it has to be technically achievable, obviously. It has to be consistent with the context of the area, and it needs to be appropriate for, the natural conditions and the socioeconomic ones. Obviously, it has to be legal, and it requires a lot of discussion with the local communities. What do they want to see? What would they be willing to take responsibility for? We developed a process a few years back when we were working in Suriname, actually, that we used to look at land use viability. And we look at what's possible, what conditions would be required for some use to be possible. And then we look at what infrastructure could be done. And then the other side of the coin is, what kind of constraints would there be? Is there something that a constraint that would actually stop something? Even if all the conditions are required, there's some other constraint. It could be legal, it could be physical, it could be cultural. And then what kind of requirements are we going to have for long-term management and maintenance? And then we go through this process where we do an assessment, we collect data, additional data as needed, and then we start a process of talking with the stakeholders, trying to give them, so we don't end up looking at everything in the world. We've already narrowed the field down of what meets the basic requirements. And then we look at options and eventually come up with a plan that we share with the stakeholders. Typically, the kinds of things that we see for land use options include everything on this list. Agriculture and forestry are very common because they're often pre-mining land uses. So those tend to continue whether we get delivered about it or not. There are places I just showed you where tourism and recreation could work. We also see sometimes it's downsizing. A big mine can't continue to operate, but maybe a small one could. More and more, we're seeing alternative energy options because we have large scale transmission infrastructure going out to the mines, and we could always come up with a energy generation facility on a mine site and use those same transmission lines to send power back out. There are a lot of other things that people look at, but there are also some constraints. And as I said before, legal requirements. There may be a requirement, and we've seen this in a few places, where people want to try and return the land as close to the initial state as possible. In other words, they don't want a solar farm or a wind farm out there. They want back to nature. There's obviously technical constraints. And then, what kind of capacity does the community have? Can they maintain in a sustainable way what you're going to do? And will they be able to shoulder or develop partnerships to shoulder the financial burdens? The more remote you are, the more difficult it is to come up with viable options. And as a result, you tend to have more limited options. This actually is a photograph of that site in Kyrgyzstan. It takes a long time to get there. It's at 4,000 meters, beautiful place. Not likely that much will happen there in the future. There's also a bunch of external factors that you have no control over. Obviously, where it is, the economic viability and just in the region. In other words, if you can't build, if you don't have a market to sell products that you can tap into, obviously, some other kind of manufacturing isn't going to work. And then a quick word about attractive nuisances. I wrote a paper on it. If you're interested, I can send it to you. Basically, this is a condition that could attract people, or in the case of mines, animals that involve risk or harm, but the trespassers are not aware of those. And this actually comes from legal term in the United States. That's the reason why we have laws that require you to put certain fences around swimming pools in your neighborhood, even on your private land. And basically, you're trying to protect people from risks they don't understand. And closed mine sites definitely have these. People will come, they will look, they will see the possibility of getting mineral resources out of there, which could lead to some kind of wealth for them. And they will not be aware of the risks that are inherent in mining sites. So, my conclusions. One of the big questions I get asked, how long should we be planning for socioeconomic mitigation? Well, in theory, if it's truly sustainable, it should be forever. Practically, that's not always going to be the case. And I think we have to be realistic about it. Obviously redevelopment of the mine could happen. We've seen that a number of times. Mineral prices change, commodities suddenly become more valuable, and somebody goes back in and redevelops the mine. If that's the highest, best use of the land, then that makes sense. You may have new landowners come in. One of the things that we always talk about is talking to our, the communities and the stakeholders. Well, the problem is the stakeholders we're talking about at the beginning of the mine life may not be the influencers at the time the mine life ends. And so talking to them about what they want may not be necessarily what the stakeholders and the population wants at the end of the mine life, which is why we do the reassess that throughout the mine life. But even if we get a good solution for the stakeholders at the end of the mine life, what about the next generation and the one after that? We don't know what they're going to want, and they may not like it. But what we have to at least strive for is that it should last long enough that we know that it's sustainable. So what's the state of the practice? Early planning, as we talked about before. And this one is really important. You cannot put together socioeconomic programs intended to develop alternative economies in a community if you try and do it at the end of the mine life. Those can take years to develop and get fully running and sustainable. And that needs to happen and be incorporated into the operational plans. You need to have a realistic assessment of what the mitigation viability of the alternatives you're looking at. And you need to manage the stakeholders' expectations. You may not be able to do everything that they would like you to do, but if you manage those expectations, you'll have a lot less challenges in the future. These are some of the challenges we see. This agreement on who's responsible, who pays for it, is the mining, in my opinion, the mining company's responsibility ends with doing the planning and leaving the site in a condition that it could be redeveloped for whatever purpose everyone agrees on, not necessarily be the people that fund the development and the ongoing support of whatever happens after they leave. Stakeholder engagement is a tough one when you talk about closure, particularly at the beginning of a mine life. Capacity development in governments and communities has been a problem for a long time, and it will continue to do so. I see that future private-public partnerships may be one of the answers to some of the challenges we've got. And we need to be realistic about the sustainability of alternatives. I often hear pie in the sky type things from people when in fact, what they're proposing may sound like a neat idea, but it's completely unsustainable. And we need to eliminate those things quickly in our assessment. So conclusions, some impacts cannot be eliminated, both physical and social and cultural and economic. We rely on models to predict the future, and sometimes that's too much. We have been evolving science and engineering throughout mine closure period the last 30 years, but we have a lot of work to do, in my opinion, still on understanding socioeconomic transitioning. But it's critical that these be self-sustaining programs, whatever we come up with. And then, of course, we really need to figure out how to develop sustainable capacity in most of the communities and governments that we work in. If you're interested, here's a few other sources of information that I've found useful. The top one is a symposium panel discussion that I hosted during COVID, but it was very interesting. I had some great guests on the panel from a number of different perspectives. I've already mentioned the mine closure toolbox, and then there's another interesting checklist for governments that I thought was a very useful source as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate it. So I think, yeah, it looks like Carl has a question.
Yeah, I have a couple actually.
Oh, great.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, what is the meaning of life? No,
42.
Yeah, 42. Very good. All right, I've written that down. A couple of things that fascinating talk, really great talk. It looks like in some of the more remote areas, you may be bringing back where I grew up, and that's a company town. Is that kind of idea? I mean, I grew up in Weed Heights, and Weed Heights, well, it still
That
exists,
explains
at
a
least.
lot, Carl.
I know I've showered every day to try to get that stain off. But I'm wondering if that may be one of the more viable ways mines could open again, especially in remote areas like Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. I can't even say all the stands. But
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it depends on, well, I mean, clearly the idea of a town, a company town, has existed for a long time here in the U.S. and elsewhere in the world. And basically, I think that probably boils down to, can you get the people you need to live close enough to the mine to work if you don't provide them that? And I think that would probably be the thing that defines those decisions. And obviously, there's a lot of places where there just is nothing. I mean, that's what the Soviets did in their time. They said, well, our geologists, and they have very good geologists, found a deposit over here, but there's nobody living anywhere near here, so we're going to build a town. And they, to some degree, they still kind of have that mentality. But at the same time, a lot of people don't want to live in a company town. We have them scattered all over the Western U.S., but they're slowly disappearing.
yeah,
and of course,
yeah.
People like, I can't remember what the guy's name is who bought Weed Heights, but he bought
Don Tibbles.
Yeah, Don Tibbles. He bought up the town, and he has people living there, which is kind of an interesting after use for the town.
Yeah, yeah. Just a couple quick things. We do a lot with bonds for environmental protection. Do you see that sort of thing ever happening for maybe getting more of the mine stakeholder into socioeconomic? Like adding bonding to the mine plan? I know bonds are kind of mostly United States, but
no, they're getting quite common in a lot of places around the world.
oh,
As
okay.
you can imagine, I've done a bit of study on that topic.
Yeah.
The thing is, there are several countries that have very specific requirements for developing a socioeconomic transitioning plan. They call it social closure, which is a term I absolutely hate, because how do you close social? I never understood that term when people used it. And I think ICMM got closer with the latest toolbox, the guide document, which calls it social transitioning, but they leave out the economic, and you can't. I mean, it's about the socioeconomics. So, they're required. You have to put a plan together in South Africa, a specific plan for, I think they call it social closure down there. And then Tanzania in the 2010 new Mining Act, they specifically required you to address that in your closure plan. What is your, how are you going to deal with the socioeconomic transitioning? In terms of bonding, maybe some parts of the world they'll start doing that. I don't foresee it here in the U.S. I think rather, and I think it would be a mistake, because tying up money in a bond or available resources, either I think that's a mistake. And I think rather what they need to do is communities and mining companies need to work together to come up with plans to develop alternative economies during the operation. Put the money there. Don't give it to, don't pay it to the banks and the insurance companies and the underwriters and stuff. That would be my suggestion. And I think that's happening. You see these written commitments between companies and communities, and I think there's probably at least an implied, if not a legal, obligation on the part of a company, once some of those documents are signed, to actually follow through.
And then the last one is just a logistics one. Where was the picture of that stamp mill that you had on your boom and bust economics? Where was that stamp mill?
That's in Western Australia.
Oh, is okay. I was wondering if it was a beautiful thing.
It was gorgeous.
I
That's why
teared
I
up
took
a
a
little
photo.
bit. Yeah. Okay. All right. Hey, thank you, Jeff. That was fantastic.
Bruce.
So Jeff, thank you very much first for your talk. My question is a kind of topic that we had quite a bit chat about it. We all agree that our social side of the mine closure is very complex. One takeaway from your talk is that even when we think we have done our part and we've been responsible, next generation will come and say that, oh, what the hell did you do? So we have this, I agree with this comment, but at the same time, we have some operation that what I call them overconfidence people on the closure. And when you're talking with them, the way they're presenting is that we've done everything flawlessly. There is nothing else we can do that making our mine closure plan any better. Do you have any comments? And I've seen it quite a bit when we are talking. I'm talking with people that they're whether ignoring, unconsciously ignoring that there is a problem, or do you truly believe that they have done everything that it's humanly is possible to close mine responsibly? So have you seen in this kind of issue in your practice, and how do you have any comments on this?
Well, I think it's rather arrogant to think that we know everything and we've got it all right. I think history proves that typically that's not true. It's in some ways it's like a computer programmer telling you that they know there's no bugs in their code. That's foolish or arrogant or both. And you've done the best you can with what you know. It doesn't mean that you got everything right. And I certainly would never make a claim like that. We try hard, we follow a process. Is it perfect? Did we miss something? Maybe we did miss something. It's probably not perfect.
No, I appreciate your comments, but when you're talking with the mine operator that they believe that there's no other way that they could do it better, how do you approach with these people? How do you convince them that yes, there might be a better way to doing what you're doing?
Well, sometimes there really is one obvious answer. At least in one aspect, say on this aspect of closure or this particular facility, this really is the best way to close it. And that's entirely possible you run into that. But when you're talking about a mine closure plan as a whole, and I'm including the socioeconomic transitioning piece of it, is the whole thing the absolute best and nothing could have been better? Probably not realistic to think that way. And I guess if I was talking to somebody about that, I would, I would focus on the process they went through. And it may well be that they haven't considered everything that I would. They may not have even looked at all of the things that I would have, for example, the socioeconomic transitioning piece. And then the other thing is did they have a team that was integrated, or did they end up with a group of silos that were trying to put something together? I think that's probably one of our biggest risks of missing out on the best solution, is that we don't include all the people we should be including. That's one of the things I like most about closure, is that it's probably one of the most multidisciplinary aspects of the mining industry. It means I get to work with lots of different people. Any other questions?
Yep. As part of educational institution, how do you see the opportunities in future workforce development for universities and institutions like us to prepare the next generation of engineers and professionals in a better way to handle socioeconomic, aspects of mine closure?
Well, I think it gets back to the siloing. Javad, you know the answer that I'm going to give you because we've talked about it. I think that we need to see programs, maybe master's programs. Maybe we start out small and go for a certificate program specifically on mine closure. I'm not aware of, at least when I last looked at it, which was probably pre-COVID, I'm not aware of anywhere in the world where they actually have an actual degree in mine closure, whether it's undergraduate or graduate. I know there's some in land rehabilitation and stuff, but really specifically focusing on the totality of mine closure, I'm not aware of one. Maybe somebody else on the call is. I know there are certificate programs on mine closure. I teach on one through one of the universities down in Santiago, Chile. But I personally think that a well-planned out multidisciplinary degree, probably advanced degree, probably master's or something, and getting all the right people in the room to teach all the different aspects, I think would be one of the ways we could actually prepare the future workforce to be able to take on some of these things and learn from us, all the mistakes we've made, the things we have finally gotten right, and maybe they can take it from where we leave it to them and come up with the answers we haven't been able to find yet.
Thank you. Any other
Jeff,
questions?
I also have a question. So
Okay.
one of the things you mentioned was that you don't necessarily think that the mines themselves or the companies behind the mines are responsible or liable, I should say, for what comes after the mine closes. And you put up you mentioned a lot of different alternatives to who might be held liable for the closure process. And I wanted to ask, you mentioned a little bit the legislative background or like the government I think you said in Suriname, where they came in and said that they were, this was government land. But in America specifically on mine closure, I mean, is it really case by case, or is there a legislative background or proceeding for who is responsible for mine closure?
Okay. Well, let me clarify that, Alexia. It's very clear legislatively in this country and many of them, so all those ones I had on that graph, all the mine closure laws around the world, In those countries, there is a liability. And again, I wasn't referring, I distinguish between liability and responsibility. There is a liability is a legal obligation, right? And yes, there are definitely legislated legal responsibilities for mine closure, and certainly in this country, in pretty much the developed world, and more in the developing nations. And that's a requirement. They must do the work. But what we're talking about is the next step. We're talking about developing alternative economies. Is it the responsibility of the mining company to, well, let's take one of the few ones that I've seen here, and well, pick a few. If you look at the book 101 Things to Do with a Hole in the Ground, they show all these great things. But whose responsibility is it to redevelop a mine site into a solar farm? Is it the responsibility of the mining company? Or is it something that would be better done by a commercial partner like a power company? I know of one site, well, actually I know of several sites here in the state of Nevada where they're probably going to be using alternative energy as part of their power supply during the operations. And it may be that they partner with an energy company to develop that. They may do it on their own. If it gets expanded after closure, would that be something that's the responsibility of the mining company to do it? Or would that be the responsibility of somebody else? And I guess the point we're making in that issue about responsibilities, who's responsible for doing the redevelopment, I would argue that the minimum requirement for a mining company is to go through a process determining what the future use might be and the vision for the future, and make sure that the closure work they do allows for that to occur. Not necessarily be the ones that fund it, not necessarily the ones who build the energy generation facility, but at least leave the site in a condition that somebody could come in and do that. And that's why I made my comment about public-private partnerships. I think the government has a role in that. I think other industries could as well. And I think in the long run, that's important. It also gets into the whole issue of stakeholder expectations. If a mining company, and I've seen this in places like Africa, where the local stakeholders just assume the mining company is going to continue to take care of them for the rest of their lives and maybe even for a few more generations. And that's just not realistic. So, you know, there has to be a point at which the mining company's responsibilities, they're no longer responsible for taking care of that community forever. It's a condition we call paternalism, and it's been a real challenge in many parts of the world.
That was a very involved answer, which I do appreciate. Yeah, I think too is paternalism is like, who is going to take care of you after this company leaves is something our country has struggled with in a lot of different industries. So hearing that from a mine perspective was really interesting. So thank you.
Anybody else? Ron, you're being quiet. Okay. I guess if there's no other questions.
Right.
I think
well, thank
Pat
you
has
so
his
much.
hand up.
Oh,
Who does?
Oh, I thought Pat had a hand up. I just thought I saw. But it's down now, so.
Okay, if there is no further questions, I would like to give my highest appreciation to Jeff for his time and great presentation and support as always to our department. And we will post this on our LinkedIn page, this recording, and you can watch it there. Everybody, I wish you a pleasant weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you everyone for coming. And I'll also be posting, Jeff, I'll be reaching out to you on your attractive nuisances paper and wicked solutions, it seems, from online. But I'll post those resources online and let you know.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks.